Welcome to Threads of Truth, the podcast where real-life mysteries meet internet speculation. Today, we explore one of the most baffling cold cases of the 21st century, the vanishing of Brian Shaffer. It is a case that presents just a brutal paradox. A young man in the prime of his life walks into a publicly monitored building and vanishes as if he was swallowed by the walls.
That paradox is exactly it. It's the engine that drives nearly 2 decades of ongoing interest and, frankly, frustration. Brian Shaffer was a high-achieving 27-year-old Ohio State University medical student. On the night of March 31st, 2006, he walked into a second-floor bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloona in Columbus, Ohio. The security cameras captured his entry, crystal clear. But despite exhaustive review, no footage at any point ever captured him leaving.
He just ceased to exist.
Yeah, within the confines of a very small, well-defined, and supposedly monitored space.
And that fact, that absolute verifiable gap in the surveillance, is what makes this case so haunting for so many of you following along. It really challenges our fundamental assumption that in the modern world, especially in a busy commercial complex like the South Campus Gateway, someone cannot simply disappear in plain sight.
Precisely. This case symbolizes this really unsettling idea that even with, ubiquitous tracking and surveillance technology, which has only gotten more intense since 2006, a person can still step into a blind spot and never return.
So our mission today is to unpack the critical timeline, analyze the impossible physical layout of the Ugly Tuna Saloona, and critically evaluate the competing theories that have defined this case. Everything from theories of voluntary disappearance fueled by grief to the suspicion of organized foul play. We want to walk through the details and really explain why, even for the most seasoned investigators, this remains a truly open question.
It's a compelling look at the limits of technology, the power of human grief, and the relentless desire for resolution when the facts they just don't compute.
Okay, so before we get into the minutes that really matter, we have to establish who Brian Shaffer was and the immense personal weight he was carrying on March 31st, 2006. This wasn't just a random night out. This was a man with a future.
He certainly was.
Yeah.
Brian was in his second year of medical school at Ohio State, which is, a demanding and highly competitive environment. He had clear ambitions.
He was on track.
Totally on track. And the sources consistently emphasize his stable personal life, too. He was in a committed, long-term relationship with his girlfriend, Alexis Wagoner, a fellow med student.
In fact, the future was so concrete that it directly contradicts this whole idea of him just walking away. We know from Alexis that he was reportedly planning to propose marriage soon.
Right.
And even more immediately, he was set to fly to Miami for spring break just 2 days after he vanished. He had plans, he had tickets, a life waiting for him.
But here is the critical pivot point. The emotional weight that casts a shadow over everything. His mother, Renee Shaffer, had died of cancer just 3 weeks prior to his disappearance. The loss was devastating.
And when you, the listener, look at this case, you have to weigh these two facts against each other. The ambitious student planning a proposal versus the grieving son reeling from a profound recent tragedy.
That grief is the potential catalyst for some of the more dramatic theories. The emotional shockwave of losing a parent is immense. And for someone already under the stress of med school, that combination creates a scenario where, highly uncharacteristic behavior becomes slightly more plausible.
Right. Did that stress factor into his actions that night, regardless of whether his disappearance was voluntary or accidental? I feel like that's the question we have to keep in mind as we analyze the timeline.
Absolutely.
Right.
So let's lock in the sequence of events that evening. Brian was celebrating the start of spring break. He started the night with his close friend, William Clint Florence. Their plan was just to hit a few bars, ending up at the Ugly Tuna Saloona.
And the Ugly Tuna is where they were later joined by Meredith Reed. To visualize this location, you really need to understand the South Campus Gateway complex. It's a retail and entertainment hub near the university. And the Ugly Tuna was on the second floor, which is a key detail, a really key detail, because it drastically limits the entry and exit points.
Yeah, and the timeline derived from the surveillance footage is very precise, right up until the moment he vanishes. They got to the Ugly Tuna pretty late. At approximately 1:15 a.m., Brian, Clint Florence, and Meredith Reed are all captured on the building's CCTV entering the bar. They were inside for about 40 minutes.
Okay, now we're at the 5 minutes that define this entire mystery. The absolute last confirmed sighting occurs at 1:55 a.m. And this isn't some shadowy figure in the distance. The footage actually captures Brian speaking briefly with two young women who were later identified as students, regulars at the bar just outside the main entrance.
Right, which is essentially a single guarded stairwell.
Ex-
The women left, presumably going down that main stairwell. Brian is then seen on the footage turning back toward the entrance, and he walks off camera back toward the interior of the bar.
And that's it. That moment, 1:55 a.m., is the final definitive trace we have of Brian Shaffer. And the bar, you have to remember, was set to close just 5 minutes later at 2 a.m.
And this tiny 5-minute window is where the answer has to be. What did he do between 1:55 a.m. and 2 a.m.? The bar was emptying out, staff were clearing up. Clint Florence and Meredith Reed were waiting just outside, expecting him to join them. But he never emerged.
And you have to ask, what did those two women, the last known people to speak with him, what did they tell the police?
Well, their statements from the initial reports just confirmed Brian was alone when he spoke to them. He appeared normal, but they couldn't offer any information about a plan to meet someone else or to, leave through a separate exit. Their contribution was really just to confirm the 1:55 a.m. timestamp and the direction he turned back inside the bar.
So the next few minutes are just chaotic. When the bar lights came on and the doors closed at 2 a.m., Clint and Meredith waited. When Brian didn't appear, I guess they initially just assumed he'd gone back inside to use the restroom, or maybe slipped out when they weren't looking.
Yeah, but when the staff confirmed the bar was empty and closing up, that's when the alarm bells started to ring. He had vanished right in front of the people who knew him.
This is the analytical heart of the case, and it's where we need to spend some real time so you can truly understand the constraints here. We have to analyze the architecture of the Ugly Tuna Saloona and the state of technology back in 2006.
Let's do that. So the Ugly Tuna Saloona was on the second floor. You have to imagine a busy commercial complex where the only way to that second floor is a single main public stairwell. That stairwell served as the principal entrance and exit.
And this main entrance was the choke point. Crucially, it was monitored by security cameras. The police assumed correctly that if Brian had walked out this standard public route at any time after 1:55 a.m., the camera would have caught him. They reviewed every single frame, hundreds of hours of video, multiple times, and the conclusion was absolute. Brian Shaffer was not seen exiting the front door.
And this is where we also have to look at the technology itself. This is 2006. So we're not talking about high-definition, AI-driven facial recognition systems. We're talking about standard CCTV, often grainy, black and white, sometimes poorly positioned footage.
Right. But the police were extremely thorough. They had to account for every possibility, including the classic disguise theory. Did he put on a jacket or, pull a hat down low?
But even disguise theory kind of falls apart when you consider the sheer volume of people leaving at 2 a.m. To miss him entirely requires either a massive blind spot that police somehow didn't account for, or a total malfunction during that specific rush. Given how committed the police were to reviewing the tape, the simplest explanation is also the most baffling. He didn't use the front door.
Which forces us to consider the only known alternative.
The back service door.
Exactly. This door was highly irregular. It was strictly for staff, for deliveries, or maybe for bands playing at the bar. It was not meant for public use.
And that door didn't just lead to some nice open corridor. It led into a first-floor hallway that was under active construction at the time. And this detail isn't peripheral, it's fundamental.
Oh yeah, a construction zone means hazards, darkness, unfinished walls, and most importantly, an unmonitored exit point to the outside. The Ugly Tuna was basically designed to be a bottleneck. That service door was the only leak.
Police skepticism about this route was high, and for good reason. Why would a medical student, possibly intoxicated after a night of celebrating, choose to navigate a dangerous, unfinished, unlit construction zone to get out, especially when his friends were waiting just feet from the main stairwell?
It's just premeditation, either on his part or someone else's.
Right. If Brian chose that exit, he was deliberately trying to avoid his friends and the public eye. If he was forced through that door, the person responsible was exploiting this unique architectural blind spot.
And investigators pursued this aggressively. They brought in cadaver dogs. But here's the problem with using dogs in a chaotic environment like a construction zone.
The results were inconclusive.
Yeah. The dogs didn't definitively pick up a scent in the construction area that would suggest a body was there or had recently passed through. It was this massive lead that just ended in a stalemate.
We also have to consider internal possibilities. Could Brian have died inside the bar? In ventilation shafts, large freezers, anything like that. But investigators confirmed the entire building, including the above-ceiling spaces and HVAC systems, was searched. They noted that the only area large enough to conceal a body permanently and inaccessibly was the construction zone itself. The bar was sealed and cleared. So the internal death theory is extremely difficult to sustain without a massive cover-up.
So to summarize the physical constraint, we are left with a single, highly monitored front door where he was not seen, and a single, difficult, unmonitored back service door that offered a path into a construction labyrinth. Every theory has to fit within those two logistical possibilities.
The immediate investigation confirmed Brian hadn't returned home. His apartment was untouched. His car was still parked where he'd left it. This ruled out the most common conclusion, that he just went home early and overslept, and it confirmed this was a genuine disappearance.
And as the investigation focused in on the last known contacts, one individual quickly became the center of the storm. Clint Florence, the friend who was with him all night.
Florence's actions created a major hurdle for public perception, even if they were legally sound. He refused to take a police polygraph test. He did so on the advice of his attorney.
And while, as we often stress on here, refusing a polygraph is a constitutionally protected right, and it holds no legal weight of guilt. In the context of a high-profile, baffling missing persons case, it acts like a massive magnet for public suspicion and internet sleuth scrutiny. Why refuse if you have nothing to hide?
The police had to navigate that public outcry very carefully. They publicly maintained they had no evidence to charge Clint Florence, and he did cooperate in other ways, providing interviews and the basic timeline. However, that refusal, coupled with the unconfirmed but persistent lead of a possible verbal altercation between Shaffer and Florence inside the bar that night, well, that solidified Florence's position as the primary subject of suspicion in online communities, and that remains true today.
That cloud of suspicion lingers because of the lack of final information. If there was an altercation, even a minor one, could that have been the impetus for Brian to storm off and use that difficult back exit just to avoid his friend? Or did it escalate into something far worse?
We also have to pause here and acknowledge the immense human cost of this, the lack of resolution. Brian's father, Randy Shaffer, dedicated the final years of his life to finding his son. He became relentlessly involved in the search, distributing flyers, speaking to the media, chasing every single lead.
This story is just marked by such a tragic layering of grief. Randy never gave up hope, but his life was cut short in 2008. He was fatally struck by a falling tree. It's an almost unbelievably cruel turn of events for a family already drowning in uncertainty.
And that second tragedy raises the emotional stakes exponentially. If Brian staged his disappearance voluntarily, the fact that he never reached out to his family, even after his father's bizarre and tragic death, it makes the theory far less probable for a lot of people. His younger brother, Derek, is now the only remaining immediate family member, and he continues the search, carrying the burden of two unresolved family tragedies.
When you look at the case, you realize the emotional vacuum is just as compelling as the physical mystery. Okay, so with the facts laid out and the physical limitations understood, we can transition to the theories that have kept this case alive in the public consciousness. Because the police and the FBI are unable to close the file, digital communities rush into that void.
And they do so with a fervor that's unmatched in a lot of other cold cases, precisely because the core premise, the failure of the camera, is just so captivating. It feels like an unsolvable riddle left by a mischievous architect or a master criminal.
Let's start with the voluntary disappearance theory, which suggests Brian used that back service door in a highly premeditated escape from his life. This theory is heavily predicated on the grief we discussed earlier.
Right. Proponents argue that the recent death of his mother, combined with the high-pressure demands of medical school, provided the necessary emotional breaking point. He decided, right then and there, that he needed a clean break.
And we have Brian's own words, which, although they were written earlier on his MySpace profile, are frequently cited as evidence of a desire for a different life. He expressed an interest in relaxed lifestyles and specifically wrote that he would rather be on a beach smoking with Bob Marley.
That quote is the classic clue that voluntary disappearance seekers latch onto. It transforms the planned spring break trip to Miami into the groundwork for a permanent move. If he intended to vanish, he already had travel plans and a plausible destination in mind, making it easier to slip away and just head south.
This theory, however, gained extremely cruel and misleading momentum from a hoax. We have to detail this because it really shaped the public discourse.
Oh, absolutely. The hoax involved an online condolence message left in his mother's obituary. It chillingly read, "To Dad, love Brian, U.S. Virgin Islands." The implication was clear. Brian was alive, safe, and had started a new life in the Caribbean.
So the police were forced to take this seriously, investigating the source. They eventually traced the message to a public computer in Ohio, proving it was a malicious hoax. But the damage was done. That initial terrible spark of hope and the geographical specificity of U.S. Virgin Islands cemented the voluntary disappearance narrative in the case's public mythology.
And for this theory to be true, you have to accept an astonishing degree of emotional callousness and sustained commitment. Brian would have had to walk away from his family, his future, his partner Alexis, and maintain total silence for 2 decades, even after knowing his father died searching for him. That level of dedication to vanishing is statistically very rare for someone who is otherwise so stable and high-functioning.
So if we assume Brian did not voluntarily vanish, or that he was somehow hidden from the front door camera, we have to look at the physical and technical possibilities of this vanishing act.
The disguise or blind spot theory is popular with the technical sleuths. Could the camera have been obscured? Was the resolution so low that rapid changes in appearance like turning up a collar, pulling down a hood, or simply walking quickly past the lens rendered him unrecognizable in the 2006 footage?
The police are adamant they checked this thoroughly, but the public always suspects a flaw in the initial review. Could he have slipped past during a brief moment of system error? Or maybe during the intense rush of people exiting at closing time where multiple faces just blurred into one? The quality of the footage is paramount here, and we know 2006 CCTV was far from perfect.
But the truly fascinating yet unconfirmed technical lead is the phone anomaly. Months after he disappeared, investigators recorded a one-time ping of Brian's phone from a cell tower located in Hilliard, Ohio, which is about 14 miles away from the Ugly Tuna Saloona.
That is just tantalizing because it suggests the phone and potentially Brian had traveled a significant distance from the original scene. It implies movement, maybe even purposeful movement.
However, the phone company immediately dismissed this as a routing glitch, a technical error where the phone temporarily connects to a distant tower due to network overlap or specific atmospheric conditions, rather than a genuine indication of location. For investigators, it was a massive spike of hope that quickly fizzled into a bureaucratic explanation. But for the digital sleuth, this data point remains definitive proof that Brian, or at least his phone, was mobile weeks after he vanished.
It perfectly illustrates the limits of technology in these cases. It provides data, but it often fails to provide the certainty you need to act on it.
Yeah. And we also loop back to the construction zone as a non-voluntary technical theory. The accident. We know the back route was hazardous. Did he slip and fall? Did he become trapped in a newly poured cement foundation or hidden beneath debris?
The chaos of a construction site is ideal for concealment. A person could easily suffer a fatal accident, a fall, head trauma, even exposure that leaves them inaccessible. The counterpoint remains the cadaver dogs, but it's still a scenario where the elements of the building itself, rather than another person, caused the disappearance.
The third major theory, foul play, is where public suspicion surrounding Clint Florence really crystallizes. This theory suggests Brian was prevented from leaving through the front door because he was already dead or incapacitated inside the bar.
Which would necessitate a confrontation or an accident inside the Ugly Tuna, immediately followed by the perpetrator needing to dispose of Brian quickly, utilizing that back service door in the 5-minute window between 1:55 a.m. and 2 a.m.
If that unconfirmed verbal altercation between Shaffer and Florence did happen, it provides a plausible, though circumstantial motive for a quick, tragic accident that someone felt compelled to cover up immediately to avoid consequences. The service door then becomes the mechanism of disposal, moving the evidence into the unmonitored construction zone or beyond.
And we have to address the public's continued fixation on Clint Florence's refusal to take the polygraph. We establish it's a legal right, that the public views it as evidence of involvement, or at the very least, knowledge of what happened. If a cover-up occurred, Florence's silence is seen as the enabling factor that allowed the crime to remain unsolved.
It's important for you to understand the distinction here. The police found no forensic evidence of a crime. They searched apartments, cars, the surrounding areas. But if the body was moved into an unknown location quickly and covertly, physical evidence might be minimal. Florence's refusal, therefore, doesn't prove guilt, but it ensures that the question of foul play involving his friend remains the most visceral and immediate theory for those following the case.
So why does this case resonate so profoundly almost 20 years later, especially among digital communities?
Because it is the perfect modern mystery. It's the ultimate glitch in the matrix scenario. You have a high-achieving, successful young man vanishing from a location that, by all accounts, should have been secured and recorded. It just challenges our contemporary reliance on technology to provide definitive answers.
It suggests a fundamental failure in the system, that even when we install cameras, they are not foolproof. The failure of the camera to record a basic action like leaving the premises provides a kind of eternal puzzle box that digital sleuths just can't walk away from. It taps into the fear that surveillance, which promises safety, can fail entirely at the moment we need it most.
Furthermore, the case remains officially active. The sources confirm the Columbus Police Department and the FBI continue to work on it. This is not a cold case resigned to obscurity. Its ongoing status underscores the difficulty and the unique nature of the vanishing act.
And the tragedy of Randy Shaffer's death, searching for his son, also gives the case a profound emotional depth that prevents it from becoming just mere armchair entertainment. It's a real family tragedy, compounded by every failed lead and every unanswered question.
So as we synthesize the evidence, let's just return to the core logistical problem. We have two main possibilities for Brian's exit. The impossible exit, which is the front door, unseen, or the unmonitored exit, which is the back service door and the construction zone.
The impossible exit is just that, impossible, unless the police review of the 2006 footage was fundamentally flawed. It requires him to have been so heavily disguised or the camera so perfectly obscured at 2 a.m. that he walked right past every eye and every frame without notice.
Logistically, the back service door remains the only viable physical route out of the bar without being recorded. This exit requires intent, either Brian's or perpetrators. If Brian left voluntarily, we have to accept that he chose a difficult, dangerous, and highly circuitous route just to avoid his friends who were waiting 5 feet from the main exit.
That speaks to an extreme level of premeditation to vanish right then, specifically from his immediate social circle, not just the general public. If he just wanted to end the night, he could have walked out the front door moments before 1:55 a.m.
Right. And we return to the difficulty of sustaining a voluntary disappearance. The level of sustained silence, abandoning a committed partner, a high-value career path, and never reaching out even after a second family tragedy, it suggests an individual either possesses a remarkable, cold-blooded dedication to vanishing or, more likely, is deceased. The fact that the silence has remained absolute for nearly 20 years lends weight, sadly, to the latter.
And if we lean toward the accidental or foul play theories, the back service door fits perfectly. It provides the mechanism needed to remove an incapacitated Brian Shaffer from the scene, exploiting the construction zone as a temporary or permanent hiding spot. The construction zone provides a plausible answer to why no body was found immediately. The theme of silence is not just confined to Brian's absence. It also touches heavily upon Clint Florence's decision about the polygraph.
Florence's refusal, while legally protected, is the single greatest unresolved psychological factor in the case for the public. It ensures that the case remains stuck in a perpetual loop of suspicion in the absence of hard evidence. It's a point of legal certainty that leads to emotional and analytical uncertainty for the investigator.
And if we look at the emotional context again, we have to analyze the influence of Brian's grief. We are talking about a young man under immense academic pressure, dealing with a recent profound loss.
How much did that stress factor into his final minutes? Did the grief make him reckless, maybe leading him to walk into the hazardous construction area, resulting in an accidental death? Did it make him impulsive and vulnerable to a confrontation? The psychological backdrop of recent bereavement just can't be ignored. It is the fuel that could have powered any of the three major theoretical outcomes.
The family tragedy also fundamentally changes the weight of the voluntary disappearance theory for us. When his father, Randy Shaffer, died so tragically in 2008, If Brian had been alive, wouldn't the death of his father, the man who dedicated the last 2 years of his life to finding him, have triggered some kind of contact?
It creates a massive hurdle of plausibility. For the voluntary disappearance theory to work, we have to assume Brian is capable of sustaining an emotional detachment that borders on sociopathic, a stark contrast to the portrait of the ambitious, committed young man we have from his medical school and personal life. The weight of that silence, post-2008, is immense.
We should also consider the role of law enforcement methodologies in 2006. Could a modern-day investigation with advanced tools like targeted geofencing of cell data or high-res image analysis have cracked the case immediately?
Almost certainly. In 2024, the phone ping anomaly would be rigorously cross-referenced with location data from every other cell user in the Hilliard area at that time. And the quality of the CCTV would be so high that the disguise theory would be instantly debunked. The timing of the case, right on the cusp of the digital surveillance boom, means the investigation was inherently hampered by the limitations of early 21st century tech.
Which brings us back to the architecture of the Ugly Tuna Saloona. It was the perfect, low-tech escape route, protected by the limitations of high-tech surveillance. It was a failure of modern security to secure one of its blind spots.
And the enduring legacy of this case is tied directly to the persistent, painful search carried on by his brother, Derek. This family has suffered a double tragedy that has kept the case visible and resonant.
And for the rest of us, Brian Shaffer's vanishing leaves us with the fundamental, chilling question that frustrates investigators and digital sleuths alike. In a world of ubiquitous cameras and rapidly expanding digital footprints, a world that only becomes more tracked every year, how does a person simply cease to exist within a space of 50 feet?
It forces us to acknowledge that sometimes the simplest explanation is obscured by the complexity of our systems. Whether it was foul play that exploited a structural flaw or a deliberate, unprecedented act of self-erasure, the fact remains that Brian Shaffer stepped off camera and out of existence.
We want you to consider that possibility. What if the security camera footage was 100% correct? What if it truly only captured him going back inside the bar at 1:55 a.m.? That means he was either confined within the building or he used the service door in the 3 minutes before the bar closed, a window so tight it argues for extreme duress or extreme preparation.
The mystery endures because we refuse to believe that modern technology can be so thoroughly defeated by a single unmonitored back stairwell. The Shaffer case is a powerful reminder that technology can provide surveillance, but it cannot always provide answers. Sometimes the smallest unmonitored blind spot, whether physical, momentary, or psychological, is all that is needed for a person to step out of their life entirely, leaving behind nothing but the cold, hard facts of their disappearance in the void of silence.
It is a truly terrifying and compelling case. Thank you for walking through this extraordinary and tragic story with us.
Our pleasure.
Next time, we explore the strange and tragic story of Matrice Richardson, a young woman released from jail at midnight, never seen alive again. Join us next time on Threads of Truth.